Sri Ram Kannan says, I am from Singapore. The other day, I was discussing with my school professor about the rise of Singapore. He said that Singapore had an Iron Man called Lee Kuan Yew, who had harmonized Singapore again under one umbrella, which had unified Singapore. He also said that colonialism in Singapore was a good thing, as it had brought English, which unified everyone under one language. He says, why can't India do the same? India should be unified under one language as well. I said that's not possible because of the cultural diversity and evolution. I would like to know your views on this matter. Do you think India can ever be unified wholly under language despite having a lot of diversity? India has always had a huge amount of diversity going back to Vedic times. It's not like during the Vedic times when the Rig Veda was written, there was only one language, Sanskrit. There must have been lots of languages spoken even then, but we have always had one unifying civilizational language. So people in various parts of India, they would have spoken various languages, but these languages are all in some way or the other interconnected, interrelated, and in some way alike. And the common language that unified everything was Sanskrit. That was always the linked language, the civilizational language. That's the language that spread across Eurasia. Yeah, and so that's how it is. Now coming to Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew is a very interesting person. Clearly, the Grand Master of Singapore, the great unifier of Singapore. He was first elected Prime Minister, I believe, in 1959. Yeah, 1959. So where is Singapore? Let's go to the map once again. Where is the map? Singapore. So we know where India is. Let's go south, south, south. And we know where Malaysia is. Yes, the Malacca Strait, we all know, I believe, because you watch my channel, you know where the Malacca Strait is. So at the other end of the Malacca Strait, you have this island city called Singapore. It's a Singapore. It's a Sanskrit name. And you can see it's at the southern tip of Malaysia. Of course, you have another part of Malaysia on this island here, Kalimantan. Yeah, Borneo or whatever. So Singapore. So there was a time when Singapore was unified with Malaysia, and then there were various issues, and the Singaporeans, I think they left Malaysia. There was this partition or whatever you want to call it, secession of Singapore from Malaysia in the early 1960s. What year was it? 63, 65, somewhere around there. Look it up. Okay, I don't memorize dates. And Lee Kuan Yew was the Prime Minister of Singapore. He was first elected 59 most likely. Then he was the Prime Minister of Singapore, essentially the dictator of Singapore, you could say, from 1965 to I think 1990. Even after 1990 he was the most powerful politician, but he did not have any official position after 1990, which actually is more suitable to being in power, no responsibilities and a lot of power. So what Lee Kuan Yew did is that he took Singapore out of, within a generation, within let's say 20 years, from the status of a third world country to a highly prosperous, highly developed first world nation with one of the highest rates of per capita GDP and one of the most amazing levels of prosperity anywhere in the world. He did this within a generation, within 20 years. So 1960s, Singapore is a third world nation with slums and broken down system and no infrastructure, nothing. By the 1980s, it is a highly prosperous first world country, very highly developed, huge booming economy, excellent prosperity. So Lee Kuan Yew was a firm believer in the English language. Yeah, of course he did resent colonialism to a certain extent, but he was kind of an Anglophile. He reformed Singapore. He instituted this very strong one-party system, essentially a one-party system, essentially a dictatorship, with a very strong focus on the economy, with a very strong focus on social harmony. Singapore is a city that's a melting pot of Indians and Chinese mainly, and Malays also, the three main ethnicities. Yeah, so he harmonized them under this umbrella of English. Yeah, social harmony, economic development, education, very strong and very rigorous education for everybody, and public housing, all these things. Yeah, so he did a superb job, a stupendous job of doing this, and the Chinese have tried to copy this. So Lee Kuan Yew was an ethnic Chinese person. So the Chinese Communist Party sent lots of officials to Singapore to study the methods of Singapore. And I think Deng Xiaoping used to say that if I have to transform Shanghai into Singapore, I can do it in a decade. But China is so enormous, it's a huge struggle. So the same thing applies to India as well. It's very easy to transform a city-state, which is just one city. The smaller the system, the more complex can be your adjustments. But the larger the system, the simpler you have to keep things, the policies and all that. So Lee Kuan Yew had this wonderful set of policies that really worked. It totally transformed Singapore. Of course, there are complaints about authoritarianism, about the imposed unifying foreign language and all those things. It's very harsh. The rule is very harsh. The fines are very harsh, and the discipline is very harsh and all that. But overall, it's worked out really great for the people of Singapore. uh, so the question is, what about India? So Lee Kuan Yew came to India a few times. He was actually, you could say, he was fond of India. I mean, if you read his books, I have a couple of his books lying around somewhere. He writes about India, and he speaks about the caste system, that the caste system and all that is going to keep India back. And he recollects that he had visited India, New Delhi, and he remembers how shoddy the Rashtrapati Bhavan was. And he remember, I think he wrote about the fact that he asked Indira Gandhi, Madam Mrs. Indira Gandhi, then Prime Minister of India, that the Indian people in Singapore are among the highest performing people in the world. Yeah, they contribute so much to Singapore, and Indians elsewhere also they stand out among all other ethnic groups. So why can't you do something in India that will unleash the potential of India? Yeah. And the answer from Mrs. Gandhi was like, no, this is the way it's going to be in India. Something to that effect. I don't know. I don't remember the name of the book, but I have it somewhere. Yeah. So that's what he said. So the thing is that it's really easy to turn around a small nation, a city state, in a decade, in 2 decades, very easy. Yeah. But the larger the system is, the more inertia and resistance it has from within, especially in the so-called federal system that we have, where you have so many different centers of political power and one center of centralized power, which is not that powerful overall. It's very complicated. The kind of system we have created after 1947, right? The setup that we have created is designed to prevent any rapid progress. That's how it is. But it's certainly something that can be worked upon, and the more you change it, the faster the change will happen. But overall, the Chinese tried to emulate the Singaporean system, and now you can see that it's kind of working to a certain extent. It takes a long time in a large country. Yeah. I mean, if you have, let's say you have a helicopter, no, forget a helicopter. Let's say you have a drone that's the size of my hand. You want to turn it around, make it flip, it can flip very fast. But let's say you have a drone the size of a building. You want to make it flip, it's going to take a long time to slowly flip around. Yeah, that's how it goes. Any physical system, including any political system, the larger it is, the slower it will move around. That's how it is. So it's certainly something that we can take inspiration from, the kind of reforms and policies that Lee Kuan Yew adopted. I do not agree with the fact that English should be the uh, unifying factor for India. We are a 10,000 plus year old civilization. Our unifying language, our civilization language has always been Sanskrit. Today, they have created an enormous amount of opposition to Sanskrit in India. And this is something that has been created over the past 100 years, especially after 1947, especially after the 1960s, the political opposition to Sanskrit from all quarters, all kinds of quarters. Yeah. So it's going to be an uphill battle for India. But eventually, if India is to regain its civilizational status as the preeminent civilization, it has to come back under Sanskrit, not English. English is the language of the oppressor, the colonizer. Right now, we use it. That's fine. We use it against them. That's all right. But eventually, we have to return to Sanskrit. That is the one unifying language we can have. English is a stopgap solution, and it's not the right solution. So yes, India can certainly be unified under one language, but that language cannot be English. It has to be Sanskrit. It has always been Sanskrit. Yeah, it is certainly possible. We have an enormous amount of cultural diversity and all that. You go to, even within a certain state, let's say Odisha, you go from northern Odisha, Uttar Kalinga, Utkal, and you go to southern Odisha, the cuisine changes, the dialect, the way of speaking changes, the way of dressing changes, everything changes, right? So it's so beautiful to have so much diversity, and yet we have always been one civilization, extending all the way to Indonesia and the Philippines and all that. So the unifying factor was dharma, the dharmic culture, and Sanskrit. So that's where India has to go back. Maybe it will take 20 years, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years, but that's the direction in which India has to go if it has to ever, like people keep on saying, Akhand Bharat, or what do they say, transforming India into Bharat, or making India the Vishwa Guru, or making India the superpower. It will not happen as long as we promote English as the link language. English is a foreign language. It's one of the worst remnants of colonialism. Yeah, and people like me are most comfortable in English. That's what's been done to us. Yeah, so English has to go. But yes, we can certainly be unified wholly under one language. That can only happen under Sanskrit. Even Hindi is not the right language. Yeah, the Hindi is an art. I mean, it's a very recent language. It's a mongrel language, a mixture. Like they say in Hindi khichdi of various things, like various Turkic dialects and some Arabic, some Persian, with overall the structure and syntax, the grammatical structure of Sanskrit, with the vocabulary of all these foreign languages. That's what Hindi is. Hindi is something that emerged out of the Turkic court, the Mughal, so-called Mughal court, and eventually Hindi has to be phased out. Hindi is not the right language to unify India. I don't know who decided and why they decided to use Hindi. I think it was the great, magnificent Mr. Nehru who did that. So Hindi eventually has to go. It can only be Sanskrit as if India has to rise again. Not English, not Hindi. It has to be Sanskrit.